The church bells tolled, and every single beat of their deep, resonating sound seemed to echo in my chest, rattling the very foundation of the life I thought I had built. I could feel it, something was wrong. It was in the air, the thick tension that hung between my shoulder blades, crawling its way into my skin. Today should have been the happiest day of my life, but instead, it felt like a dagger being slowly twisted in my back. I stood at the end of the aisle, every eye in the room on me. The music swelled in my ears, but my heartbeat was louder. The satin of my wedding dress clung to my body like a second skin, the lace trim brushing the floor with each step. I could taste the sweetness of the champagne from the pre-wedding toast on my lips. But it was bitter now, soured by the hollow sensation in my chest. James, my fiancé. He stood at the altar, waiting for me, or so I thought. His sharp jawline and neatly combed hair made him look every bit the part of a perfect husband-to-be. He was everything I had ever wanted, or so I convinced myself for the last 5 years. As I approached him, I could feel his gaze on me. But there was something off. It wasn't the love I had been promised, the adoration I had dreamed of. It was something distant, something cold. The crowd watched in rapt attention. My family, his family, everyone we knew, all gathered to witness the start of our life together. And yet, I felt like I was walking through a fog, disconnected, trapped in a dream that was about to shatter. The scent of roses and lavender filled the air, but all I could smell was fear. I reached the altar, and saw the faintest tremor in his hands as he took mine. His fingers were cold, like ice against my skin. I had imagined this moment for years. This was supposed to be the pinnacle, the declaration of forever, but now? Now it felt like a funeral procession, not a wedding. "Are you nervous?" I asked, my voice betraying the uncertainty gnawing at my insides. He forced a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not," he replied, his voice tight, strained. I felt it, the tremor in his voice. And then, as I looked into his eyes, I saw it. The truth. A quiet, almost imperceptible flicker of guilt. It hit me like a slap, sharp and raw. Before I could speak, the heavy wooden doors of the church creaked open, interrupting the ceremony. The world seemed to freeze. A woman stepped into the doorway, Lydia. Lydia had always been there, a shadow in the corner of our lives. A ghost from James's past. The one woman who had broken his heart years before we even met. I had heard about her, of course. I had listened to his stories of their love, their breakup, how she was the one that got away. And I had always told myself it didn't matter, that it was ancient history. But now, as she stood there, framed by the church's grand doorway, I knew that history had never really been forgotten. It had simply been lying in wait. Lydia was the kind of woman who would make any room pause in awe. Tall, with dark, cascading hair that framed her angular face like a raven's wing. Her skin, flawless and smooth, glowed even in the dim light of the church. She wore a black dress that seemed to swallow the light, her presence commanding in a way that I could never quite master. She was beautiful, dangerous, and she made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. James's face lost all color. His expression crumbled, the facade of calm composure slipping away as he looked at her. For a fleeting moment he was lost, completely lost, his eyes locked on hers with a yearning that cut through me like a knife. I stood frozen, my heart racing faster than it ever had. My palms began to sweat, my fingers trembling as I clutched the bouquet of roses tighter. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them, from the woman who had stolen so much of his heart, from the woman who had never really left. Her eyes met mine, cold, sharp, calculating. James turned to face me, his voice low, apologetic. "Lila, I can't do this. I can't marry you." The world tilted. It was like someone had flipped a switch, and suddenly, everything was in motion. My heart, once full of anticipation, felt like it had been ripped from my chest. My voice barely rose above a whisper. "What? What do you mean? We've been planning this day for months, for years. You're supposed to be my husband." His words were fractured, his eyes desperate but unable to meet mine. "I'm sorry, Lila. I never should have let it get this far." The words echoed through me like a death knell. My body, frozen in place, could barely process what was happening. He, James was leaving me. In front of everyone, on our wedding day. For her. Lydia's lips curled into a small victorious smile. She stepped forward, her heels clicking ominously against the stone floor. I think it's time, James. You know what we have to do. The words were like poison, seeping into my veins, making everything feel surreal. I turned away, my vision blurring with tears I refused to shed in front of anyone. My world had come crashing down around me, and I was standing there, a doll in the middle of a broken story. Everything after that moment felt like a blur, an endless parade of apologies, half-formed explanations, and the rising crescendo of anger and hurt I couldn't suppress. But there was no fight left in me, no words that could make it right. The truth was too clear now, too painfully obvious. He had never truly chosen me. Lydia was the one he had always wanted. And me? I was just the woman who had filled the gap in the time between her departure and her return. The wedding, the dress, the dream. It was all a lie. I stood outside the church, the cold air hitting me like a slap, my mind reeling with the reality of my broken future. The scent of roses was replaced by the distant sound of thunder rumbling through the sky. Rain. It felt fitting. Days passed. My world was in shambles. I spent hours in silence, wrapped in blankets of grief and disbelief. My friends and family tried to console me, but all I could feel was emptiness. Then came Ethan. Ethan had been a friend long before he had ever been anything more. He was the man I ran to when James wasn't there, the one who held my hand when I cried. But Ethan wasn't my first choice. He had never been the dream. He was quiet, thoughtful, and never the kind of man I had pictured myself marrying. He was the kind of man I could rely on, but I had always thought I needed something more. But Ethan never left. He was there when I needed him most. When the pieces of my life were scattered on the floor, and all I had left was me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized something. He wasn't just there for me. He was everything I needed. He loved me without condition, without the ghosts of past loves lingering between us. And so, on a quiet afternoon, I made a decision. I would not wait for James to come back, for Lydia to leave. I would move forward, without them. I would marry Ethan. The rain pelted against the windows like 100 tiny fists. It wasn't the kind of storm you could ignore, the kind that seemed to tear at the world outside, demanding your attention, forcing you to confront it. The kind of storm that mirrored what was happening inside me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the soft fabric of my wedding dress still clinging to my body. The delicate lace and satin had turned into a suffocating cocoon, an unwelcome reminder of a life I was no longer a part of. I hadn't taken it off since I left the church. I couldn't bring myself to. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was some twisted hope that by staying in the dress, I would somehow still be connected to the woman I was supposed to be. The room was quiet, save for the soft sound of rain against the glass, but my mind was anything but. It was a cacophony of broken thoughts, 1,000 whys racing through my head in a futile attempt to make sense of what had just happened. I replayed every moment in that church, each second replaying like a film on loop, each scene more agonizing than the last. I had seen James look at Lydia, the look in his eyes. It wasn't just affection or nostalgia. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be erased by the vows we had exchanged, by the promises he had made, by the life we had planned. I should have known. There had always been something off about him. The late nights, the phone calls he'd refuse to answer in front of me, the way his hand would tighten around my wrist whenever I brought up Lydia. I had told myself it was nothing, just insecurities, just the worries of a woman who feared losing her place in his life. But I had lost my place long before today. I just hadn't been able to see it. I closed my eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I had been a fool, a complete fool to think that love, the love I had given him so freely, would ever be enough. A knock on the door broke my reverie. Lila? My mother's voice was gentle, hesitant, but full of concern. I could hear her on the other side, waiting for me to respond. I didn't answer. What could I possibly say? That I was okay? That everything was going to be fine? No, it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. My entire world had been turned upside down, and I was barely hanging on. Lila, sweetie, please open the door. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, before I stood and walked slowly to the door. I didn't want to face her. Didn't want to admit that everything I had built in my mind was gone. But I couldn't stay here, in this silence, forever. When I opened the door, I saw her standing there, her face a mixture of sadness and confusion, her eyes brimming with concern. My mother, always the epitome of strength, was crumbling under the weight of what had happened. Her perfectly styled hair, her immaculate makeup, her designer clothes, they were all out of place in this moment, in this room. She looked like a woman who had been caught in the storm, and hadn't yet found shelter. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't have to go through this alone." I nodded, but my throat was tight. The words caught in my chest, like something too big to say. How could I tell her that the life she had dreamed for me, the life she had planned out since I was a little girl, was gone? That I wasn't the woman she thought I was? That I wasn't the woman who had made it to her wedding day, ready to walk down the aisle to a man she thought loved her? I wasn't that woman anymore. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking as the tears finally broke free. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm drowning." She stepped into the room and embraced me tightly, holding me as if I were still the little girl who needed her comfort. I could feel the warmth of her arms, the softness of her breath against my ear, and for a fleeting moment I allowed myself to sink into her embrace. But even then, deep down, something told me I had to let go. I had to pull myself together. This wasn't about us anymore, it was about me. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered. "I know. But you're not alone. You will never be alone." I pulled away, wiping the tears from my eyes, forcing myself to be strong. "Mom, I have to do this on my own. I have to figure out who I am without him." My voice was shaky, but the words were clear. I needed to reclaim my life. My life, not the one I had been living for him, for his family, for the expectations they had set. She didn't argue. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes soft but full of understanding. I saw it then. The depth of her love for me. The way she had always been my protector, my pillar. But this was different. This wasn't about protecting me from the world. This was about me learning how to protect myself. The next few days passed in a blur of well-meaning messages, phone calls from friends, and a constant parade of sympathy that made me want to scream. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on what had happened. Everyone seemed to have advice on how I should feel, what I should do next. But no one had the answers I needed. The phone rang late one afternoon. I had been sitting on the couch for hours, trying to distract myself from my thoughts. I didn't want to hear from anyone. I didn't want to answer. But then the name flashed on the screen. Ethan. I hadn't heard from him since the wedding. He had been at the church, but I had been too lost in the chaos of the moment to notice him, to see that he was the one person who hadn't abandoned me. The one person who had always been there. I took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Lila," his voice was soft, low, as though he too was trying to find the right words. "I'm so sorry. I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. How was I holding up? How could I answer that question? My life had been reduced to a series of fractured pieces, and I didn't know where to begin. I don't know, Ethan," I whispered. "I thought I had everything figured out, but now it's all falling apart. I don't know who I am anymore." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if he were considering his words carefully. "You'll figure it out, you'll find yourself again. I know you, Lila. You're stronger than you think." His words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I could find myself again. Maybe I could rebuild the pieces that James had shattered. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do it alone, Lila. You never have to do it alone." I closed my eyes, letting his words sink in. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to stop pretending to be strong. Maybe it was time to let someone help me. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in days, I believed it was a road worth walking. The days that followed were a blur of white noise. The world continued to spin around me while I stood still, paralyzed by the crushing weight of everything I had lost. The wreckage of my dreams, the shattered pieces of my perfect life. They lay scattered across the floor, taunting me with their once glimmering promises. But for the first time in days, I did not feel the sting of betrayal. I felt numb. I had returned to the family home, retreating into the safety of the walls that had watched me grow up. The house was a comfortable cocoon, familiar in a way that helped me breathe, but not enough to ease the turmoil roiling inside me. I wandered through the rooms, aimlessly, as if searching for something I couldn't name. The silence of the house was deafening. The scent of my mother's lavender perfume still lingered in the hallway. Her presence was a constant, always in the background, but I knew she was giving me space. She had always been the one to hold things together, strong, composed, but even I could see the cracks in her carefully crafted facade. She too had hoped for this wedding. The wedding that was supposed to be the culmination of everything she had dreamed for me. The woman she had raised to become a perfect bride. But now, I was nothing but a broken version of the woman I had once thought I was. The sun filtered in through the grand windows of the living room, casting long shadows across the floor. The old rug, worn from years of footfalls, lay at my feet. The room felt too large, too empty, without the laughter of family gatherings, or the clinking of champagne glasses. Everything was too quiet. I had retreated to my room, the one I had spent countless nights dreaming of my wedding day. It was decorated in soft pastels, delicate shades of lavender and cream. The bed was neatly made, the pillows fluffed, just as they always had been. But as I sat there, my gaze falling upon the empty space beside me, I realized just how much had changed. I picked up the small hand mirror from the vanity, running my fingers over the smooth surface. It was the mirror I had used since I was a little girl, the one my mother had given me before I left for college. I used it to apply my makeup for my wedding day, to make myself look perfect, to become the woman James wanted. But now, as I gazed into the reflection, I barely recognized the woman who stared back. My makeup was smeared from tears, my hair disheveled, strands of it clinging to my face. But it wasn't just the physical change that struck me. It was something deeper. Something in the way I had lost the light in my eyes. Something in the hollow, vacant look I wore. I had been so caught up in the ideal of him, in the love I thought we shared, that I had forgotten who I truly was. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of anger rise within me. Not at James, not at Lydia, but at myself. I had let myself become someone I didn't even recognize. I had allowed myself to be swept up in a love that was not mine. A love that in the end was never meant to be. I had spent so many years building a life around someone else's version of happiness that I didn't know how to create my own. The anger swelled inside me, sharp and burning, and I threw the mirror across the room. It hit the wall with a loud crash, splintering the glass into 1,000 jagged pieces. My heart raced as the sound reverberated in the silence. The broken reflection of the woman I had tried to be stared back at me from the shards on the floor, mocking me, reminding me of the fractured pieces of myself I had left behind. And then, as the adrenaline ebbed away, I collapsed to my knees on the carpet. The tears came again, but this time, they felt different. They weren't just the tears of a heartbroken woman. They were the tears of someone who had been buried alive. Someone who had been suffocating in a life she didn't choose. And now, finally, I was beginning to wake up. I lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling as the rain continued its relentless assault against the windows. The soft pattering of raindrops mixed with the silence of the house, and I realized that for the first time in days, I felt something again. The numbness was slowly slipping away. I was beginning to feel the weight of my grief, my pain, but I was also beginning to feel the stirrings of something else, hope. A soft knock on the door broke my thoughts, and I wiped my face hastily, trying to compose myself. I knew it was him. Ethan. Ethan had always been there. He was the friend who had picked up the pieces of my broken heart long before James had shattered it again. The one who had stayed when the world around me had crumbled. But even now, in my most vulnerable state, I was hesitant. How could I face him? How could I face anyone after everything that had happened? Lila? His voice was muffled through the door, but it was soft, comforting. Ethan had never been loud, never been brash. He was like a steady, calm river, never rushing, always flowing at a pace that allowed you to breathe. I wiped the remnants of my tears away, took a deep breath and stood up. I had to face this. I had to face him. Slowly, I opened the door. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning me with quiet concern. He was dressed casually, jeans and a t-shirt, his hair messy, as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. But it was the look in his eyes that caught me. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even sympathy. It was understanding. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low, hesitant. He didn't need permission. I would have let him in even if he hadn't asked. "Of course," I replied softly, stepping aside. He walked in, looking around the room briefly, his gaze falling on the shards of glass scattered across the floor. I hadn't even realized they were still there. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, kneeling down to start picking up the broken pieces. "But I thought you might need someone." I shook my head, a soft laugh escaping my lips, though it held no humor. "You always know what to say." He met my eyes, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I know you, Lila. You've been pretending for so long that everything was okay. But it's not, and that's fine. It's okay not to be okay." His words pierced through the veil of my numbness. I hadn't wanted to admit it to myself, but I had been pretending. Pretending that everything was fine, that I was fine. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I was far from fine. I had lost myself in a story that wasn't mine. And now I had to rebuild. Ethan stayed with me for hours that day. He didn't push me to talk. He didn't demand answers. He just was. And that was enough. I found comfort in his silence. In the quiet understanding that passed between us. He knew. He knew that the healing wouldn't come in one day, or even 1 week. He knew that it would take time. That night, as I lay in bed, I closed my eyes and let the tears come again. But this time, they were different. They weren't just tears of loss. They were tears of release. I had finally allowed myself to grieve. I had allowed myself to feel. And for the first time, I felt free. The next morning the sun broke through the storm clouds, bathing the room in golden light. I stood in front of the mirror again, but this time, I saw something different. A new version of myself reflected back at me, stronger, wiser, more determined. The woman who had been so blinded by love was now beginning to see clearly. And she was ready to move forward. I was no longer the woman who had been left at the altar. I was no longer the woman defined by the man who had abandoned me. I was Lila. And I was going to rebuild. The days after the storm had passed, but the weight of it lingered, hanging in the air like a thick fog that refused to lift. I woke up every morning staring at the ceiling of my childhood room, the smell of lavender and dust swirling together as I tried to hold on to the illusion that everything would be okay. But it wasn't. My heart ached. Every inch of my body, every corner of my mind, screamed out with the remnants of the betrayal, of the life that had been shattered so effortlessly. I tried to put on the mask, to pretend I was fine when I wasn't, but it was becoming harder to hold up the facade. And even though I had Ethan, his comforting presence never seemed to be enough. His quiet strength was soothing. But it didn't fix what had been broken. Each morning, I stumbled out of bed, feeling the heavy weight of my decisions, the ones I couldn't undo, the promises that had been broken. The wedding dress still hung in the back of my closet, draped in its box like a ghost, a mockery of everything I had imagined for myself. It felt like a piece of someone else's life, a life I no longer recognized as my own. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection, my eyes looking back at me with a mixture of fatigue, grief, and something else. I could see it, the change. The woman who had once been so naive, so confident, was now a stranger. But was that really so bad? I had been living a lie. Or at least, I had let myself believe in a lie. I had built my life around a man who hadn't truly loved me. And the hardest part was realizing that I had let him shape me into someone I wasn't. I had given him my heart, my dreams, my very identity. Now, I had to take it all back. But how? How did you begin again, when the person you had been was someone you no longer recognized? It had been a week since my wedding day, and every day had been a battle. The bitterness, the hurt, the resentment all simmered inside me. And I knew I couldn't continue pretending like it wasn't there. I needed to confront my past. And that meant confronting him, James. I hadn't spoken to him since the wedding. After that moment in the church, when he left me standing at the altar with Lydia, I had cut him out of my life completely. I deleted his number, blocked his emails, even went as far as to avoid any mutual friends who might mention him. It wasn't out of cowardice. It was out of necessity. I needed space. I needed to heal. But even in that silence, I couldn't escape him. I could feel him in everything: the old photos in the house, the songs we had once shared, the places we had visited. The memories crept into my mind, uninvited, flooding me with the warmth of the past before they twisted into the sharp pain of the present. I knew that the past wouldn't leave me behind until I had faced it. Until I had dealt with the truth. But where to begin? How do you look at the man who had broken you and not fall apart again? How do you face the truth about someone you once loved without feeling the weight of every shattered hope? It was that thought that led me to his office. I had been avoiding it for days, but now, sitting at my mother's dining table, the silence was overwhelming. I needed answers. I needed closure. My fingers trembled as I picked up the phone and dialed his number. The first few rings felt like an eternity, each one echoing in my chest with growing anxiety. When he picked up, the sound of his voice made me flinch. "Lila," he said, his voice soft, hesitant. "I didn't think you'd call." The bitterness that had been brewing inside me surged to the surface. "You didn't think I would call? You thought you could just leave me standing there on our wedding day and I wouldn't care?" "Lila," he said again, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. It's just that I never stopped loving her. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want to hurt you." The words stung, more than I expected. More than I wanted. But this was the moment I needed. I could feel the tears threatening to fall, but I refused to let them. I wasn't going to cry for him anymore. Not now. Not ever again. "So you're telling me," I said, my voice steady but trembling with emotion, "that all these years, the love you promised me, was a lie? You were never really mine?" There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then, he spoke. "I was wrong," James said. "I was selfish and I hurt you. But I never meant for this to happen. You were never a mistake, Lila. I just thought I could move on. But I couldn't." The words, meant to soothe, only made the wound worse. The anger that I had buried deep inside me burst forth like a flood. "Well, it doesn't matter anymore, James," I said, my voice cold now, my hands clenched tightly around the phone. "You had your chance. And you blew it. You don't get to break me anymore." There was a long pause, and for the first time in our conversation, I didn't hear the pain in his voice. I didn't hear the apology. All I heard was the sound of silence. And that was enough. "I need to go," I said, my voice firm, almost indifferent. "Goodbye, James." I ended the call without another word. The phone call left me exhausted, emotionally drained, but somehow, lighter. It felt like I had finally taken a weight off my chest. The one I had been carrying for so long. I had confronted the man who had once meant everything to me, and I had told him that I didn't need him anymore. And for the first time, I realized something. He had never really been mine to begin with. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. My mind kept replaying the conversation, the things I had said. But as I listened to the quiet hum of the house, I realized that I was starting to understand. James had been a part of my life, but he wasn't my life. He wasn't the definition of who I was. I had spent so many years building my identity around someone else's expectations, around a man who didn't see me for who I truly was. I had tried to force a love that wasn't meant to be. But now, I was beginning to see the truth. I didn't need to be someone's second choice to be happy. I didn't need validation from a man who couldn't love me the way I deserved. Ethan's face flashed in my mind then. Calm, steady, patient. Ethan, who had been there when I didn't know how to ask for help. Ethan, who didn't try to fix me, but instead stood by me, quietly waiting for me to heal at my own pace. The next morning, I woke up with a newfound sense of purpose. I didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but I knew one thing. I was going to walk it alone. For a while at least. I was going to rebuild my life, piece by piece. I was going to learn who I was, without the weight of James or anyone else on my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I was going to be Lila. Not James's wife. Not the woman left at the altar. But me. The woman who had survived, who had fought for her life and her happiness, and who is now ready to claim it back? The days seemed to move at their own pace, each one stretching into the next with an almost unbearable slowness. The world outside continued its ceaseless movement, but inside the walls of the house, time felt suspended. I spent my mornings in a haze of routine. Waking up, eating, moving through my day without much purpose. It wasn't depression, at least not in the way I had experienced it before. It was more like waiting. Waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for the pieces of my life to fall back into place. But with each passing day, the pain of my broken future faded just a little more, replaced by something I hadn't expected: silence. A deep, suffocating silence that wrapped itself around my heart. It was a kind of peace, a stillness that was unfamiliar to me, but that I began to crave in ways I hadn't anticipated. In the quiet, I was able to hear my own thoughts again, to reconnect with the person I had buried under years of expectations and romantic ideals. I would wake early, before the house stirred, and sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sky shift from pale gray to soft blue as the sun began its climb. The rain had stopped, and in its absence, the world seemed to breathe again. I found comfort in the small, simple things: watching the birds outside, the way the light played on the leaves of the trees, the scent of coffee brewing downstairs. But there was something about the stillness that also made me feel the absence more keenly. My phone remained silent, the text messages that had flooded in at first now tapering off, each one a reminder that people had moved on, that they had their own lives to live. I wasn't bitter about it. It was just the reality of things. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being suspended in time. Like a ship adrift on an endless sea. It had been a week since I had spoken to James, but the weight of his absence still hung heavy in the air. And yet, I found myself thinking of him less and less. I knew that confronting him hadn't given me closure, it hadn't offered any answers. But it had freed me from the relentless cycle of wondering why. I had accepted it. He had chosen her. And there was nothing I could do to change it. The real work, the real challenge, was in understanding why I had ever let myself believe in something so fragile. Why had I, so capable in every other area of my life, let my happiness hinge on someone else? Why had I allowed myself to be swayed by the superficiality of romance and the empty promises that James had made, without ever really questioning them? To find the answer, I knew I had to look at my past, my upbringing, the way I had been raised to believe in fairy tales and happily ever afters. I had been taught that love was a destination, a final chapter in a story of pure devotion. My mother had always told me that love was the most important thing, that once I found it, nothing else mattered. But was it really love? Or had I just been conditioned to believe in an ideal that didn't exist? I took a deep breath, my fingers brushing over the pages of an old family photo album that had been tucked away in the attic. The leather cover was worn, the edges frayed from years of use. It was a relic of a different time, my childhood, my parents' love story. A simpler time when I still believed in the certainty of things. The first page was a picture of my parents on their wedding day. My mother was radiant in a white dress, her smile bright and full of promise. My father stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his face filled with a love that I had always believed to be unshakable. The photograph was a symbol of everything I thought love should be. Unwavering, eternal, and perfect. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw a different side of them. The photos of family vacations, the quiet moments at home, there were no smiles in those pictures. There was tension. My father's eyes were often distant, his smile forced. My mother was always the one to put on a brave face, to smile through the cracks. And then there were the later years, when the smiles faded altogether. I hadn't realized it until now, but my parents had never really been happy. They had built a life around appearances, around expectations, not love. And it wasn't that they didn't love each other. It was just that love as they had known it wasn't enough. They had built their world on superficiality, on the image of perfection, and I had inherited that same idea. I had believed that love, once found, was supposed to fix everything. I closed the album, my heart heavy with the realization. I had spent so much time chasing an illusion, so much time building my life around a version of love that had never been real. And I had paid the price for it. That afternoon, I found myself sitting in the backyard, the sun now warm on my skin, as I watched the grass sway gently in the breeze. The world had never seemed more alive. I breathed in deeply, letting the fresh air fill my lungs, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could exhale fully. Ethan showed up around dusk. He had started doing that lately, stopping by unannounced, never pushing me to talk but always there, sitting quietly with me, offering me his presence like a steady anchor. He never asked how I was doing because he knew that question was too big. He didn't try to fill the silence with words, he just let it be. He took a seat beside me on the porch swing, his eyes scanning the yard before meeting mine. He was quiet for a long moment, and I realized just how much I had come to rely on this silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was necessary. "I saw James today," he said, his voice soft. The mention of James made my chest tighten, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to run from this. "How is he?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Ethan looked at me, his expression serious. "He's struggling, he's trying to figure things out, but I don't think he knows what to do with himself anymore." I nodded, more to myself than to Ethan. "He's always been lost," I said softly, my voice distant. "I just didn't know it." Ethan's hand reached out, lightly resting on mine. It wasn't a grand gesture, it didn't feel like he was trying to fix me. It was just comfort. The warmth of his hand, the quiet strength he exuded, were like a balm to my raw wounds. "I think you're figuring it out now," Ethan said, his voice low, full of conviction. "You're not the same woman you were before." The words stung in a good way. He was right. I wasn't the same woman, and I didn't think I ever wanted to go back to being her. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure what else to say. Ethan nodded, his eyes holding mine for a moment longer before he stood up. "Take your time, Lila, I'm here. Whenever you need me." I watched him walk away, the gentle sway of the porch swing barely making a sound. He was right. I was starting to find myself again, but it wasn't going to be easy. And it wasn't going to be quick. Healing was a slow burn, one that had to be nurtured, not rushed. But I was no longer afraid of the silence. In fact, I was starting to see it as my ally, the space I needed to become whole again. That evening, as I lay in bed, the weight of the day finally began to settle around me. The quiet of the house felt less oppressive now. In fact, it felt almost comforting. I realized how much I had needed this space, this time to rediscover who I was. I had spent so many years building my life around James, around our relationship, that I had lost track of my own dreams, my own desires. But now, I could feel them bubbling to the surface. I didn't need a man to validate my existence. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was worthy. I was worthy all on my own. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the stirrings of something new, something just for me. The next day, I woke up with purpose. I started making small changes in my routine, rearranging my room, taking long walks, picking up hobbies I had abandoned long ago. And little by little, I began to realize that I was finding myself again. The woman I had been before James had walked into my life, before I had let his love define me. This was the first step toward my independence. And it was only just the beginning. The days felt lighter now, not in a way that made the world seem easy, but in the way a burden might lift after years of wear. The weight on my chest, the suffocating pressure that had filled me with dread every morning, was slowly being replaced by something else. A space. A possibility. I was starting to breathe again. Deeply, freely. But it wasn't the absence of James that brought me peace. It was the presence of my own thoughts, my own needs. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was losing myself in the process. It had been weeks since the wedding. Weeks since I had left the life I thought I wanted. Left the man I thought I loved. I had avoided the news and the social media posts that circulated about James and Lydia, images of their blissful reunion. The pictures of their smiles, the affectionate captions, the feeling of them moving on, while I stayed suspended in time. It hurt. It always would. But it didn't have the same weight it once had. With each passing day, their images became less sharp, less vivid. They began to blur into the background of my life, as they should have always been. The healing process didn't happen in a straight line. It wasn't as though one day I woke up free of the pain and uncertainty. The broken pieces of me had to be gathered with care, like shards of glass. And it wasn't a matter of fixing the cracks, no, It was about embracing them, learning to live with the imperfections. I spent a lot of time alone, but it wasn't loneliness. It was the quiet hum of reflection. I read more than I had in years: novels, poetry, essays. Stories of women who had overcome impossible odds. Tales of survival and self-discovery. There was power in the written word, in seeing your own pain mirrored by someone else's experience. The words didn't always offer answers, but they offered solace. A reminder that pain, as overwhelming as it felt, was not forever. One evening, as the sky outside softened to a gentle rose, I stood in front of my closet. It had become my sanctuary of sorts, where I found comfort in the familiar fabrics that hung neatly before me. The dresses, the coats, the shoes, all symbols of a life I had once thought I would wear forever. But now, as I looked at them, I realized they no longer fit. Not just in size but in the person I was becoming. I grabbed a bag and began to pull out the items I no longer felt represented who I was. The evening gowns, the carefully chosen outfits for dates with James, the expensive heels that had made me feel elegant yet uncomfortable in my own skin. It was time to let go. I didn't need these reminders of who I had been. I needed space for who I was becoming. And there was something incredibly freeing about it. I had spent so much time fighting against the current of my past, that I had forgotten to consider the flow of the future. The future was full of possibility, but it was also filled with uncertainty. What did I want for myself? What kind of life would I create now that I no longer had the plan I had built around James? In the past, I had always put others first. I had been the partner, the dutiful girlfriend, the woman who existed to support and love. But now, for the first time, I asked myself, what do I want? The answer was both simple and profound. I wanted freedom. Freedom from the chains of expectation, freedom from the pressure of perfection, and freedom from the version of myself that I had let be defined by another. I wanted to travel, to experience the world in ways that had always seemed out of reach. I wanted to learn, to grow, to step into the world not as someone's lover, but as myself. I signed up for an art class. I had always loved painting but had pushed it aside in favor of other interests, other people. I knew it wasn't going to solve everything, nothing ever did, but it was a small step in the direction of me. It was an investment in myself, in my own happiness, and it felt like the most honest thing I had done in months. Ethan continued to be a constant presence in my life. But there was something different now. The days we spent together no longer felt like moments in limbo. There was no longer a sense of waiting for something to happen, for some dramatic shift to occur. Instead, we enjoyed each other's company, finding comfort in the routine of shared meals, late-night conversations, and quiet afternoons spent watching movies. But underneath it all, I could sense a change, a shift that wasn't entirely unexpected. As I grew stronger, as I became more comfortable with my own independence, I realized that Ethan wasn't just a friend anymore. He was something more, but the question was, what was that something? One evening, we sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast sky. It was a night filled with the sounds of crickets, and the occasional rustling of the trees. We had spent hours talking, but now there was a comfortable silence between us. It was the kind of silence that felt like a shared understanding, a recognition of what had been and what was still to come. "Lila," Ethan said suddenly, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been here for you. I've always been here. And I always will be." I turned my head to face him, my heart pounding a little faster in my chest. "I know, Ethan, you've been my rock. I can't thank you enough for that." He smiled softly, but there was something deeper in his expression. Something more vulnerable. "I know you're still healing, still finding yourself again. But I need you to know something. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you. I'm here because I care about you. And I always have." I met his gaze, really meeting it for the first time. And in that moment, I knew. I knew that what we had was something real. Something that had been quietly growing between us in the spaces where pain and grief had once filled the air. But I couldn't rush it. I wasn't ready to jump into anything yet. Not with Ethan, not with anyone. I needed to be sure of myself first. I needed to understand who I was without anyone else's expectations weighing me down. "I care about you too, Ethan," I said, my voice steady but soft. But I can't give you anything right now. I'm still figuring things out. Still healing. He nodded, his smile gentle, his hand reaching for mine. Take your time, Lila. I'll be here when you're ready. It was in that moment that I realized how much I had changed. I was no longer the woman who needed someone else to complete her. I was learning how to stand on my own, and that made me feel stronger than I had ever felt before. It had been several weeks since I had started my art class. At first I wasn't sure what I was doing there. The canvas felt like an intimidating blank slate, and the strokes of my paintbrush felt awkward, clumsy. But with each lesson, I grew more confident. The instructor was kind, patient, always encouraging me to explore my own creativity. I found a sense of freedom in the messy strokes, in the unrefined shapes. There was no need to be perfect, there was just the process of creation, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to be perfect. Each day brought new challenges, new realizations about who I was becoming. And each day, I felt myself moving closer to the woman I had been before James, but stronger, wiser. The woman who had dreams, who had ambitions, who had a life all her own. A woman who no longer needed validation from a man. And the most important thing I had learned? Healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about integrating it, making peace with it, and using it as the foundation for a new, better future. The weeks had passed in a slow, gradual pattern of healing and self-discovery. I had allowed myself to breathe again, to exist without the constant weight of expectations bearing down on me. The pain of James's abandonment was still there, a faint echo in the back of my mind, but it was no longer all-consuming. The wound had begun to scar over, not perfectly, but in a way that allowed me to function without constantly reliving the pain of what had been lost. My art had become my solace. I spent hours each day in my small studio, the room I had converted into a sanctuary where I could focus solely on the process of creating. The canvas had become an extension of myself, an exploration of all the feelings I had been too afraid to express. Each brushstroke felt like an act of self-liberation, each color, a part of me that I was slowly rediscovering. Ethan had remained a steady presence in my life, and I was grateful for that. He never pushed me to do anything I wasn't ready for. He was patient, understanding, and always there when I needed him. But I could feel the shift in our dynamic. I could see the way he looked at me, the way his presence seemed to fill every room we were in. And I realized, I had been falling for him. It wasn't the passionate, all-consuming love I had felt for James. It wasn't based on a whirlwind of romantic ideals, or the need to complete each other. It was different, deeper, quieter, and steadier. I had come to understand that love could be quiet, and still. That it didn't always have to be loud and dramatic to be real. But there was something I still had to face. The reality of James's return. I had just finished a painting of a sunrise, its warm hues a reflection of the new life I had begun to create for myself. The brush in my hand trembled slightly as I stepped back, admiring the delicate balance of colors. The sun, rising slowly over the horizon, symbolized the beginning of a new chapter, my chapter. But then there was a knock on the door. A knock that made my stomach tighten, my heart rate quicken. I didn't need to open the door to know who it was. James. I had no intention of seeing him, of reopening the wounds he had caused. I had built a new life, one that didn't involve him. But the knock repeated, louder this time, as if demanding my attention. I stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do. But something inside me stirred. I had been avoiding him, yes. But maybe this was the last piece I needed to truly move on. I couldn't hide forever. I had to face him, not for him, but for me. I opened the door and there he was, standing on the other side, just as handsome as I remembered, his face filled with uncertainty. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability that caught me off guard. "Lila," he said softly, his voice full of regret. "Can we talk?" I stared at him for a long moment, my mind racing. There was a time when I would have said yes without question, when I would have opened my heart to him again. But that time was gone. I was no longer the woman who needed him to define her worth. I took a step back, allowing him into the doorway, but I didn't invite him in. "You left me at the altar," I said, my voice steady but cold. "What could we possibly talk about now?" James hesitated, looking down at the floor for a moment before meeting my gaze. "I know I hurt you, Lila. and I'll never be able to undo what I've done. But I need to explain myself. I need you to understand why I did it. I wanted to tell him I didn't need his explanation. I didn't need his words to fill the space between us. But a part of me, a small part, still wanted to know. Still wanted the answers that would close the chapter for good. "I'm listening," I said, my voice unwavering. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging. "I thought I could move on with you. But the truth is, I never truly let go of Lydia. I tried to convince myself that I could make it work with you, but I was lying to both of us. I wasn't ready for a commitment. I was running away from something that had always haunted me." I nodded slowly, taking in his words, but they didn't move me the way they once would have. I had spent so long looking for answers, for closure, but now I realized something. I didn't need his explanation to find peace. I had already found it, in my own way. "I understand now," I said quietly, my voice calm but firm. "You weren't the right person for me, and I wasn't the right person for you. We both needed to learn that the hard way. But I've moved on, James. I'm not the woman who stood at the altar anymore. That person is gone." James's face fell, but there was a trace of relief in his eyes. He nodded slowly, as if understanding for the first time that this conversation was for my sake, not his. "I'm glad you're okay, Lila," he said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "I'm sorry for everything, truly." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had made his choices, and I had made mine. I no longer needed him to validate my worth. I had learned that the only person who could do that was me. As James left, the weight in my chest lifted. It wasn't a magical moment, but it was a significant one. I had faced the past, spoken the words I needed to speak, and in doing so, I had severed the last tie that had bound me to the person I used to be. I closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet. The house, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like home, my home. I had created it, piece by piece, with my own hands, with my own decisions. And I was beginning to realize just how strong I had become. But there was still a part of me, deep down, that wondered what could have been. Could I have had a life with James, one free of the lies, free of the pain? But that was a question that didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was what I had. And what I had was my freedom. I walked to the window, looking out at the skyline as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the streets below. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a calm certainty that I had chosen the right path. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Ethan was right. I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was whole, just as I was. In the weeks that followed, I began to focus more on myself. I poured my heart into my art, finding new joy in the creation process. The once daunting blank canvas became a symbol of new beginnings, and every painting I completed felt like a small victory. I no longer had the weight of James's expectations on my shoulders. My world was now mine to shape. And as my confidence grew, so did my relationship with Ethan. We spent more time together, simple moments, like cooking dinner together or hiking in the nearby woods. There was no rush, no pressure to define what we had. It was comfortable. It was steady. And I had never realized before how much I had craved that kind of peace. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the deepening night sky, Ethan turned to me, his eyes filled with warmth and something deeper. "Lila," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I know you're still finding your way, but I want you to know something. I care about you. More than I ever thought possible." I looked at him, my heart swelling with an emotion I wasn't sure I could name. For the first time, I let go of my fear. Let go of the uncertainty about my future. I knew what I wanted. "I care about you too, Ethan," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm ready. For whatever comes next." The weeks that followed James's visit were quiet, peaceful, and surprisingly filled with growth. I found myself spending more time in my art studio, my hands coated in paint, the brush sweeping across canvas as I let my emotions pour into every stroke. For the first time, I didn't have to worry about the approval of anyone but myself. I wasn't painting for anyone else. I was painting for me. And that made all the difference. Ethan and I continued to grow closer. But there was no pressure, no rush. I had learned that love, real love, didn't need to be hurried. It didn't need to be defined by expectations or timelines. It was something organic, something that blossomed naturally, without force. Ethan respected my space, my healing, and in doing so, he had become a constant presence, a steady and gentle force that I could always rely on. Our connection deepened without words, through shared moments, glances, and the comfort of being in each other's presence. But I knew that I wasn't ready to rush into anything serious. Not yet. My heart, though healing, was still fragile. But what Ethan gave me was exactly what I needed, a sense of peace and security. He never demanded anything of me. And in his quiet understanding, I realized something. I could love again, but it would be on my own terms. When I was ready. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I found myself reflecting on the months that had passed. The storm of my life had passed, and now in its wake, there was this profound calm. I was me. Just me. I wasn't the woman who had been left at the altar, or the one who had been broken by love. I was the woman who had rebuilt her life from the ashes. A phone call interrupted my reverie, and I glanced at the screen to see an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but something in my gut urged me to pick up. Hello? Lila? The voice on the other end was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. Lydia, I said, surprised, but not surprised. I didn't know why she was calling, but I had a feeling it was something important. I didn't know who else to talk to, she said, her voice quieter than I had expected. There was a hesitation there, something vulnerable. I sat up straighter, my curiosity piqued. What's going on? I know you probably hate me, she said softly. And I don't blame you for it, but I'm trying to make sense of everything. Of what happened between James and me. And I need your help. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had been prepared for many things when it came to Lydia. Anger, resentment, defiance, but not this. Not the vulnerability she was offering. I'm listening, I said, my voice calm, almost detached. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to understand something. James and I were never meant to be, Lydia continued. We were kids when we first got together. And in the years that passed I thought I was in love with him, but I wasn't in love. And I think I've always known that, but I didn't want to admit it. When he came back into my life, I was selfish. I wanted him back. But it wasn't because I loved him, it was because I thought I needed him to validate me. Her words, raw and unguarded, resonated with me. I had been through a similar journey. I had been clinging to a love I thought I needed, not because it was real, but because it was easier than facing the truth. I don't hate you, Lydia, I said quietly. I think we were both trapped by the same lie, the idea that love should fix everything, but love isn't about fixing someone, it's about choosing them, without condition, and neither you nor I had that from James. There was a long pause on the line, a silence that spoke volumes. And then, Lydia spoke again, her voice softer this time. Thank you, she said. I think I needed to hear that more than I realized. I hung up after a few more words were exchanged, but something inside me shifted. I had spent so much time seeing Lydia as the enemy, as the woman who had stolen James from me. But now I realized something important. She wasn't the villain in my story, I was. I had let my resentment define my path for so long. I had let anger and betrayal cloud my judgment, but that didn't have to be my truth anymore. The process of letting go wasn't something that happened all at once. It was gradual. One morning, I woke up to a message from Ethan. I was thinking, he wrote, that maybe we should take a trip together, just the two of us, a fresh start, no expectations, just exploring the world and seeing what's out there. I smiled at the message, a warmth spreading through me. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment where I chose my life. I had built it from the ground up, piece by piece. And now, it was time to live it, to step forward and embrace the future. I'd love that, I replied, feeling a quiet joy bloom in my chest. I wasn't running away. I was stepping forward. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Ethan and I decided on a road trip across the country, exploring places I had always wanted to see but had never made time for. It wasn't about escaping anything, it was about discovering a new chapter, a new story, one that didn't require anyone else to write it but me. The trip was everything I needed. It was a reminder that there was still beauty in the world, still places untouched by the pain of the past. With Ethan by my side, I didn't need anything else. We explored mountains, quiet forests, and lakes that shimmered under the sun. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. We didn't rush. There was no need for labels, no need for commitments. There was just us. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely whole. Years passed, and life continued to unfold in ways I could never have predicted. Ethan and I built a life together, one that wasn't based on romantic ideals or grand gestures, but on quiet, consistent love. We traveled, we explored, and we created a home that reflected who we had become as individuals, and as a couple. My art became my voice, and my voice became my truth. I was no longer defined by the love I thought I had lost. I was defined by my strength, by my resilience, and by my ability to rise from the ashes of my past. I had created something beautiful, not just in my work but in my life. And James, well, he remained a part of the past. A chapter that I had closed. I had forgiven him, not for him but for me. I had learned to move on, to embrace the future without looking over my shoulder. Lydia and I never became best friends, but there was a quiet respect between us now, a shared understanding of what it meant to learn from our mistakes. As I stood before a new canvas, preparing to paint yet another chapter of my life, I smiled. I was no longer the woman left at the altar. I was the woman who had built herself back up. I had found love, not in someone else's arms but in my own. And with that love, I could face whatever the future had in store.